Hello and welcome to another anime lore and theory video. I'm Shergok, your host, and today we are going to take a closer look at Ainz Ooal Gown's mental state and whether or not Ainz Ooal Gown can be healed from his emotional dampener, the very condition that enables him to act as an overlord in the first place. But before we're going to take a closer look at any of this, let me quickly thank my Patreons for supporting this channel, as well as say thanks to all users of the YouTube thanks function for making one-time donations. And with that said, let's get to the topic at hand. The beginning of the story of Overlord starts with the end of Ainz Ooal Online, what was initially supposed to be a server shutdown of the DMORPG and just going offline turned into one of the greatest, yet paradoxically not the most emotional of journeys that Satoru Suzuki, the true name of the undead overlord Ainz Ooal Gown, would ever experience. But to understand what happened and how these events affected Ainz Ooal Gown, we must start at the very beginning. The year is 2138. The world as we know it lies in ruins, unrecognizable. The seas are poisonous. The ground is covered in acidic sludge. The rain is corrosive and oily, and the Earth's atmosphere has become so toxic that one would die without a gas mask. And even with one, you will likely need a lung transplant by your mid-30s to survive, or rather an artificial lung. And on top of that, the world has been rendered radioactive due to a nuclear war. Agriculture only happens inside of domes and greenhouses now, and only the rich can afford to live under open skies in the so-called paradise domes. In other words, our world now outwardly resembles a planet from Warhammer 40k, but internally, surprisingly little has changed. There are no religious cults spreading their dogma from fortress-like temples, no skeletal god worshipped on a golden throne, and no fanatical servant caste blindly following him to the death. At least not yet. Instead, Satoru Suzuki was just an average Japanese man trying to survive in this world, with all that entails, and his mother died from karoshi, the consequence of extreme overwork, while preparing what could still pass as his favorite meal, or what counts as food, in the year 2138. But her sacrifice wasn't in vain. Thanks to it, Satoru was able to attend the extremely expensive elementary schooling, which in the year 2138 qualified him to become a salaryman, a regular office worker. And that alone nearly put him into the middle class, at least financially. Don't get me wrong, he still rents a one-bedroom apartment. And it is tiny by comparison, but at least he has money to spare. And although Ainz Ooal Gown always felt like a loser due to social anxiety and below-average looks, at least he had his finances under control, and he always kept an emergency reserve in his bank account and could afford to spend a third of his salary on his one and only hobby, the video game Ainz Ooal Online, along with his VR setup. And what a setup it was! While VR games in our world, aside from Japanese 3D body connector video games and the third Half-Life title, haven't quite caught on yet, in the new world of the year 2138, VR games were for many the only way to go outside and touch grass, because they were just that realistic. And this VR tech included a headset that not only delivers visuals to the eyes, but also reads and scans the brainwaves. And then there's the port in the person's neck. Oh, and fun fact, even in the year 2138, there's no home office for the average working man. Something that might have seemed strange a decade ago, since virtual conference rooms should have been made possible with the technology of the year 2138, and it should have made commuting obsolete, or at least very, very, very rare. And companies could also have saved money on office space. But from today's point of view, I must say, bullseye. They were completely right. Even after the apocalypse, companies will still force you to show up at the office, no matter the cost to you or to them. As long as your boss can work from his home office. Anyway, this neck pod allows the VR network to connect directly to your own nervous system, enabling not just visuals, but also a sense of movement and touch. In other words, Ainz Ooal Gown already had the same point of view through his own character's eyes, as a human, that he would later experience in the parallel world. And conversely, this very interface, the neck pod, could directly intercept the impulse to move sent from the brain to the arms and the legs, and translate it into movement of the avatar within the video game. And it was there that he met his guild, his friends and acquaintances, that Ainz Ooal Gown, that Satoru Suzuki, had a social life. And unusually for an online video game guild, they would not just talk about the game, but also about work, free time, family, and personal issues. They were deeply connected, and yet over time they lost touch. Work, family, and other obligations left no room in a world dominated by massive conglomerates for this kind of spare time anymore. From the only remaining guild member that we meet during the main story of Overlord, Hiro, right at the very beginning, we learn that the only way to even somewhat manage the stress and sleep deprivation of the daily life is with medication now. What followed were workers who were too tired and too drained to do anything other than work and spent what little time remained with his own family. And that's not only tragic, it's likely also a critique of Japanese long working hours, which are still the norm, often accompanied by sleep deprivation and low productivity despite a high workload and a long time on the clock. And so Ainz Ooal Gown was left with nothing but his memories in this dying video game Yggdrasil Online. Ainz didn't do much anymore but farm monsters to keep the guild running and to pay for its upkeep. And he didn't want to form new friendships. He was still attached to his old life, his old social circle, and with the very happy memories he had with them. And as Yggdrasil Online lost more and more players to games like Aberrage and others, more modern titles would dominate and slowly drain the life out of Yggdrasil. And so, after 12 years, finally, the servers were finally shut down at midnight, at 12 p.m. And Ainz had just finished meeting Hiro, intended to spend his final moments in this very game, sitting on the throne in the Great Tomb of Nazarick. Because normally, he would have been locked out and gone to bed, ready to head back to work the next morning. But instead he remained in the game. More than that, he felt more, saw more, and even began to smell things within the game. Something that shouldn't have been possible with his VR headset, as the port in the neck didn't have enough bandwidth to transmit all of these data, nor did it have a connection to the sense of smell or taste. In other words, everything we know points that Ainz Ooal Gown had been awakened inside the body of his avatar, an undead overlord, in a medieval-style parallel fantasy world filled with magic and dragons. Or more accurately, that his entire guild base was transported and materialized there. Presumably this was the result of a failed ritual by the Dragon Emperor from this very own dimension, this parallel world, who attempted to use part of the New World's magic to pull over objects that he saw in this parallel dimension, our own world, driven by his greed. And he did not realize that Yggdrasil Online was just a video game world within another, much more destroyed world, a world bereft of magic. And this misunderstanding transported the entire guild from the video game into this new parallel dimension. But again, this is only a theory, and we don't know for sure whether or not this happened the way I described it, or if something else had happened. Although much points to it having happened that way, or at least in a similar manner. And in this new world, not only were the NPCs created by Ainz Ooal Gown and his guildmates now real, but even the guild itself was tangible. And even the in-game lore that Ainz Ooal Gown and his friends had just added to add some flavor came to be. a cauldron that was meant to generate unlimited food, which was just a simple bit of lore and flavor, had become quite literally a bottomless pit of food, a bottomless pot if you will, and the many monsters in the guild, originally created to defend it from enemies, truly became the servant of this undead overlord, and the floor guardians, the elite of the guild, became his loyal followers and servants, eternally devoted and ready to do nearly anything for their overlord that he commands. But that wasn't all. His body also became real. But this wasn't the body of a human from the year 2138, but that of an undead overlord, animated by magic and dark arcane energy. And as an overlord, Ainz Ooal Gown also became immune to disease, the need for sleep, hunger and thirst. As an undead being animated by the arcane forces, Ainz also could no longer eat or drink, and he was unaffected by the many other things that would normally scare a human being. And his entire being was also flipped. His very existence had been flipped on the opposite side of life. And now healing magic would harm him, while dark, life-draining undead energy not only empowered him, but also healed him. And in addition to all these spells and abilities he now possessed, he was also immune to mind control. And this immunity initially showed itself very, very subtly. Although Ainz had landed in a parallel dimension that had no experience as a ruler or maintaining his face in this situation, and although he was surrounded by dangerous monsters who could tear him apart with ease, despite his enormous power, he managed not only to function as an undead overlord, but to at least convincingly portray a genius master strategist to his loyal devoted followers. And he also remained surprisingly calm in most situations, which he first attributed to a guild member named Punito Mo, who once advised him to stay calm, take a moment to think, to breathe, and only act after gathering his thoughts. But Ainz began to realize more and more how much he had changed, and this became clear when he witnessed an entire village being slaughtered by knights, seemingly from the Baharud Empire. He felt nothing for those people, only intervening because he remembered the emotions and the human connection he had once shared with Touch Me, the guild member and former leader who originally recruited and saved him, and he now wanted to return the favor to Touch Me. And he helped this village of Karen out of his emotional loyalty to an old friend. And he did not feel anything watching this massacre play out. He didn't care for what he saw, he wasn't affected by it, and he realized that he should have been affected. And even though Ainz Ooal Gown could still feel weak emotions, new sensory impressions could only evoke very, very shallow feelings, and even the strongest emotions were now suppressed by his body shortly after they arose. Joy, anger, sorrow, and hatred were all reduced to echoes, shadows of what they once had been. And the only strong emotions that still influenced him came from his old life and his old friends. And when Ainz took a life for his very first time, he felt nothing. The act of killing someone with his very own hands was so insignificant to him that he didn't even register an emotion. This emotional dampener was so potent that on the battlefield of the Cuts Plain, when you unleashed the spawn of an outer god upon an army of conscripted farmers, he couldn't think about the victims, about their pain, their suffering, and the sorrow of their loved ones. He couldn't think about anything really, other than how the display of his skill's power could be used to the advantage of the guild and the benefit of the Great Tomb of Nezarec, even though he again had realized what he was doing and that hundreds of thousands would die, all because of one single spell of his. Anything that could impair or drastically alter his mind or psyche was suppressed by his immunity to mental attacks and mind control. And this means that in Ainz Ooal Gown's case, emotions are technically still present, but extremely weakened and faint. So in other words, Ainz could only function in his role as an undead overlord because the emotional dampener shielded him from his emotional distress, his insecurity, and his sheer panic being transported into this new world. The very emotions that would have made it clear that this was real, that this was life-changing, and that he should be scared. That he was now given immense power. All of these emotions were suppressed to a faint echo. Which brings us to the question, can Ainz Ooal Gown be healed from his emotional dampener? And if so, what effects would that have? And there are many possibilities and many possible ways this emotional suppressor could be deactivated. For instance, Sheltier Bloodfallen is not affected by it the same way that Ainz or Yuri Alpha are. And Evil Eye, also a vampire, clearly displays far more emotions than Ainz Ooal Gown ever could. In other words, a simple class change from undead overlord to something like an undead vampire lord could potentially be enough to let Ainz Ooal Gown feel emotions again, like he did before. However, this would completely ruin his character build, because he needs to lose levels in order for this class change to happen. And Ainz Ooal Gown's equipment, from the rings that he wears, to the robe of Ainz Ooal Gown, and to the guild weapon, the staff of Ainz Ooal Gown, it is all precisely tailored to this undead overlord class build, and changing his class now would severely weaken or even destroy the synergy effects between his gear and abilities. On top of that, leveling up again after such a class change would be significantly harder for Ainz. Unlike an Yggdrasil Online, he no longer has direct control over which skills he unlocks or how he learns them. In other words, his build would become as chaotic and unoptimized at worst as Zashi's build is. But here's a silver lining on the pitch-black horizon. Because of the stored experience in the world item Avarice and Generosity, part of the needed experience points might already be available. Still, such a class change just to regain unfiltered emotions is likely something Ainz, in his current emotionally dulled state, wouldn't agree to. So while it may be possible, I don't think Ainz would go through with it. Next, there's the item Wish Upon a Star, a ring that Ainz acquired after countless attempts through the game's gacha mechanics, meaning he spent massive amounts of real-world money to obtain it. And this ring contains a powerful dormant magic. It allows the user to cast the spell Wish, the most powerful spell in Dungeons & Dragons, on which much of Overlord's magic system is based, 3 times for free, with no cost attached. That means no experience points or levels needed to fuel the spell. And even after the failed healing attempt on Sheltier, the ring still has 2 remaining charges. And it's likely Ainz possesses additional copies of the ring. So even if a wish like to feel emotions again like a human would be considered too broad, Ainz could potentially use the ring to unlock specific emotions like joy, love, and so on and so forth. And this, I believe, would be a far more realistic and effective way to cure his emotional dampener. And finally, Ainz Ooal Gown possesses a total of 11 world items, and among these, it's quite possible that one of them has the ability to remove or negate his emotional suppression for good. After all, world-class items are known to be capable of undoing the effects of other world-class items. However, only the 20 most powerful world items are able to override or negate the effects of other world-class items. Normally, world items would neutralize each other, meaning if one person wears a world item and another tries to use a fire spell powered by a different world item, the effect is nullified, and the same works both ways. But the top 20 world items can override this and break through other world items' effects, but only once, because then they disappear and respawn somewhere in the world of Overlord. And from Ainz's current rational and emotionless perspective, that's likely enough of a reason to not waste a powerful one-time use item just to restore his emotions. And as a fourth bonus method, Ainz could also try to study wild magic or ask a wild magic user to help him, but the most powerful wild magic users are all Dragon Lords, who are still hostile towards him, and he would have to remove his own world item, the red orb embedded in his own body, for the magic to work, which he almost certainly wouldn't agree to. Furthermore, Ainz would have to spend a long time studying and experimenting to learn wild magic well enough to affect himself without causing harmful side effects, if he could learn it at all. So in other words, I don't think wild magic is the answer either. Lastly, in the chibi comedy series of Overlord, Pleiades, Ainz accidentally used an item called Absolute Excitement. And this item serves to remove the emotional barrier of undead beings. In other words, Ainz already used, at least in this sketch series, an item that lifts his emotional suppression. And it was, to put it mildly, a disaster. Ainz became terrified of his very own reflection. His face in the mirror scared him, and he was in a state of near constant panic, and having been emotionally dulled for so long, he found the sudden flood of emotions nearly impossible to handle. As a result, Ainz would no longer be able to play the role of an undead overlord in many ways. Ainz was only able to convincingly act as the supreme ruler, despite his lack of education and real leadership experience, because his emotions were suppressed. In other words, the pain he felt during the battle with Sheltir, the sight of the villagers and the massacre of the Cuts Plain, the horrors Demiurge unleashed in the Holy Kingdom, the humiliation Climb suffered in the throne room in front of Princess Renna, all of these events would not have been possible for Ainz to tolerate without emotional suppression. And if that suppression were lifted, the memories would also surely haunt him and drive him into despair. Ainz would come to realize that by his own standards he had committed monstrous acts, and he would be completely incapable of continuing his quest for world domination through the Sorcerer Kingdom or the Great Tomb of Nezarec, just because his NPCs might be disappointed if he suddenly changed the plans. But that's not the only consequence of Ainz Ooal Gown's emotional control breaking down. The Great Tomb of Nezarec isn't just filled with all sorts of terrible horrors. It also contains the homunculi mates, the Pleiades battle mates, and an albedo who would be more than happy to bear the next generation of undead overlords. And without his emotional dampener, Ainz Ooal Gown would likely struggle immensely to control himself, especially considering the very fact that he has zero experience with women, and that every single female entity in Nezarec would kill just to gain the status of even being his pet. And Nameral Gamma made it pretty clear by simply stating that being the pet of Ainz Ooal Gown, referring to Hamuske that is, would be a position that nearly everybody would actually kill for. And let's not forget Solution Epsilon, who once literally absorbed and hid Ainz Sapphire Slime inside her very own body, essentially kidnapping it, just because she was jealous that it was in charge of Ainz Ooal Gown's personal care, and that it cleaned the body of the undead overlord. And again, this slime only cleaned the complex and very intricate skeletal body of Ainz Ooal Gown. In other words, Ainz Ooal Gown would no longer be able to restrain himself and would completely fail in his role as a ruler, driven by instinct and overcome with many emotions, instead of a mix of cold rationality and a melancholic clinging to the memories of his old friends and the NPCs they created. Ainz Ooal Gown would be an emotional mess. And ironically, this would be a huge gain and a huge boon for the new world, because emotionally, Ainz Ooal Gown might not be able to bring himself to fully conquer it, at least not in the fashion that he did in the Kingdom of Riestais, considering how bloody his campaigns had been so far. And given how panicked Ainz seemed after using the emotional restoration item, Absolute Excitement, it's possible he wouldn't even be interested in removing his dampener, if it meant losing control over himself. However, one thing would definitely change: his priorities. Ainz might suddenly change course entirely and redirect all of Nezric's efforts towards finding his friends, and perhaps with the help of world items or wild magic, he could even find a way back to the old world as his in-game avatar, keeping all of his powers intact. And for the old world, this would be a catastrophe. Imagine what an emotionalized Ainz Ooal Gown would do if he discovered that his dear friend Bell River had died in the year 2138 due to some dark conspiracy in the old world by some of the mega corporations. Ainz's rage and despair could very well usher in a second apocalypse. But on the flip side, he might finally be able to find a social life outside of work and made some friends. And with that said, that's all for today. And this video turned out way longer than actually intended, but I hope you still enjoyed it. And with that said, now it's your turn. What do you think about this video and Ainz Ooal Gown's emotional dampener? Let me know it down in the comments. Do you think it's worthy, a great cause to heal it, to remove it? Or is this basically the only thing that Ainz Ooal Gown has that keeps him in check and functioning? Let me know it in the comments as well. And while you type, I say thank you very much for watching, and thanks to all of my Patreons who have chosen this topic for today. And also, I say my special thanks to Other Daddy Other, ASK, Bad Girl Ye, Bad Burrito 316, Beezer, Ben C, Brandon S, Brandon D, Chrissy, Crowley 0221, Sia, Crystal Prime, Dead Slime, Death is Mercy, Deathless Dragonlord, Demon Xenomorph 1987, Devin Downen, Ding Dong, Din Pep, Dragonlord Placido Saxophone, Duckwagon, Dunkler Krieger, Dystopia, Dystopia II, Enigmatic Unicorn, Feralshivan, Guy with That Head, Hector Marino, Hoss, Huster, Jacob G, Jana B, Jason, J. Morris, Chromius, Kyle R, Lee K. Long, Legendarius, Le Louche Britannia with a Mustache, Lexus Fox, Lord Nishikian Rai, Lord Touch Me, Loverazor, Merowek, Mr. Shoes, Mr. Tweaker, Michael R, Michael Y, Nope, Oh Hell No, Normal Toad, O'Kill, Overlord General Gasper, Paddy Pentum, Personage, Ruru, Primus 11, Rhinomere, Q&A Caracos P, Shergox's Daddy, Shadow Lightning Wolf, Shrine Keeper, Sir Axolotl, Super Tier Magic Batista Bomb, Supreme Cheese, Staris, Ted, Texas Deer, The Orc Warboss, Rocket Smasher, T.E. Wang, Vash Hawkeye, Vegito27, Venture Fanatic, Wilhelm, Xenokai, and Sonegon. Thanks guys. Anyway, have a nice day, and I hope to see you all again soon on my next video.